Let me tell you something that nobody who wasn't there would believe. And I mean that literally, not in the way people say it casually, like, you wouldn't believe how crowded the market was, or you wouldn't believe what she said to me. I mean it in the way where if I hadn't been standing exactly where I was standing, hadn't been breathing the exact sulfur-tinged air of Vethara Station's lower deck when it happened, I would have called anyone who told me this story a liar, a dramatic, attention-hungry liar. But I was there. I was 32 years old, 3 months into a supply contract that was supposed to be the easiest money I'd ever made, and I was watching the last coalition fleet burn against the dark. There's a particular kind of silence that falls when something enormous dies, not the silence of a room going quiet, not the hush before a speech. I mean the silence when a ship the size of a city splits across the middle and the sound reaches you a half-second later and you realize your ears weren't ready for it, and so your brain just refuses the noise, replaces it with nothing, with this terrible ringing nothing. That was the silence I was standing inside when Commander Yavara Thesik's flagship, the Verath Ascending, folded in half and burned. That was the moment I understood that we, and by we, I mean every living thing on this side of the Kessler breach that wasn't Vrethkai, were going to lose. And that was about 3 hours before everything changed. I should back up. You need to know where we were, what this place was, why any of this mattered. Vethara Station sits, or sat, I suppose I should say, because it's different now at the gravitational median between two systems. The Solen system to the south, which had 3 habitable planets and 12 colonies that had been growing for about 200 years, and the breach system to the north, which had nothing habitable, nothing worth taking except for one thing, the Kessler breach itself. The breach is a naturally occurring fold in spacetime, not a wormhole, not a manufactured gate, something older, something that the Vrethkai had apparently known about for centuries and had been patient about. Very, very patient. Because the breach connects 2 points in the galaxy that would otherwise be 700 light-years apart, and on the other side of it the Vrethkai had been building, quietly, for generations. I know this because later, much later, when the dust had settled and the hearings had happened and people had started writing books about it, I read everything I could find. But at the time, standing on Vethara Station's observation deck with my mug of rehydrated coffee cooling in my hands, all I knew was what everyone on the station knew. That 3 weeks ago, something had come through the breach. Something large. Something that had destroyed the monitoring outpost on the other side in about 40 seconds. The coalition had scrambled. Of course they had. 5 species, 19 fleet-capable civilizations, the best military coordination the known galaxy had assembled in 200 years. I had watched them arrive at Vethara Station over the course of those 3 weeks. The Thesikian battle cruisers with their violet spectrum drives that turned the station windows purple for hours after they passed. The Loron carrier clusters, those beautiful, strange things that moved in groups and communicated through vibration, so that you felt them before you saw them. The Marathi destroyers, which looked fragile, almost decorative, until you understood what their hull materials did to incoming fire. And the Veth Coalition's own home fleet. Commander Yavara Thesik herself had passed through the station 2 days before the battle. I'd seen her from across the docking bay. She was tall, even for a Thesikian, nearly 3 meters, her secondary arms folded behind her back in the formal resting position, her crest lowered in the way that meant she was thinking hard and didn't want to be interrupted. Her adjutants moved around her like fish around something large in the water. She had looked to me like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I think about that a lot. That image of her, confident and precise and enormous, crossing the bay floor with that particular walk that military commanders develop, purposeful but unhurried, like time itself is waiting for them. I think about it because 2 days later she was dead, and her ship was fire, and the coalition was breaking apart at a rate that the tactical displays on the observation deck could barely update fast enough to show. Let me describe Vethara Station properly, because it matters. It was not a glamorous place. It had been built as a way station, refueling, resupply, minor repairs, and it had that functional ugliness that practical things develop when nobody has time to care about aesthetics. The corridors were wide, because wide corridors are easier to maintain and to move cargo through, but the ceilings were low, and the lighting was the kind of flat white that makes everyone look slightly unwell. There were 3 observation decks. The top one, level 7, had the best view and was technically restricted to station command and fleet officers. The middle one, level 4, was open to contracted personnel, which included me. The bottom one, level 1, was theoretically a public space, but nobody used it because the view was mostly the underside of the docking scaffold and a lot of pipes. Level 4 was where I spent most of the battle. There were maybe 40 of us in there by the time things got serious. Supply contractors like me, a few journalists who'd arrived thinking they were covering a diplomatic demonstration of force and had slowly realized they were covering something else. Some station maintenance crew who'd given up pretending to do their jobs. A pair of Loron scientists who were supposed to be studying the breach's energy signature and were now watching their equipment register things that their models hadn't predicted. The observation windows on level 4 were composite glass, thick enough to be blast-resistant up to a certain threshold, polarized automatically when the exterior light exceeded safe levels, which meant that during the battle they kept flickering, darkening and lightening in a rhythm that matched the detonations outside, so that watching the fight was like watching it through someone's eyelids. That flickering, I still see it sometimes when I'm falling asleep. The Vrethkai ships were unlike anything in the Coalition's tactical databases. That was the first problem, and it was a large one. Every Coalition warship was designed and armed and crewed based on a common framework of known threats. You plan for what you've faced, what you can model, what your weapons were built to counter. When something walks out of the dark that your weapons weren't built for, you have a very bad few minutes while your commanders recalibrate. The Vrethkai gave the Coalition approximately 0 minutes to recalibrate. From the observation deck, they looked at first almost like asteroids. That was by design, I later learned. Their ship hulls were coated with something that absorbed most scanning frequencies and reflected the visual spectrum in ways that mimicked natural rock formations. They came through the breach in a configuration that looked, on the long-range displays, like a debris field. A dense one, yes, an unusual one, but debris fields near breach events weren't unheard of. By the time the Coalition scanners had correctly identified what they were looking at, the Vrethkai had closed to half the effective range of the Coalition's primary weapons batteries. I wasn't watching the tactical displays when the first shots were fired. I was watching through the window. The first thing I saw was color, a deep, pulsing amber that had no business being in space, too warm, too organic, like the light you see through your eyelids when you face the sun. It came from the direction of the breach and spread in a wave pattern, not a beam. Like a sound wave but made of light, made of something. And where that amber light touched the Coalition's forward picket line. The ships didn't explode, that's what I keep coming back to. When you imagine a ship being destroyed in space, you picture an explosion, a fireball to breathe the drama of violent decompression. The Vrethkai weapon didn't do that. It did something quieter and worse. The ships in the forward picket line simply stopped. Their drives went dark. Their weapons went silent. And then slowly they began to drift, intact, whole, just dead. 37 ships in the picket line, 37 crews, gone in about 90 seconds. Someone on level 4 behind me made a sound I'd never heard a person make before. Not a scream, not a sob. Something in between, cut short, like they'd started one and couldn't finish either. The Coalition responded. Of course they responded. These were the best military minds in the known galaxy, and they weren't going to stand still after a first strike. The cruiser wings broke into their assault formations. The Marathi destroyers did that thing they do where they seem to vanish from one position and appear in another, not faster than light, just incredibly fast subliminal maneuver, the kind of acceleration that would kill any organic crew. But the Marathi were working with something else inside those beautiful fragile-looking hulls. The return fire was significant. I don't have the tactical language to describe it precisely, but I can tell you what it looked like from level 4. It looked like someone had opened all the light in the universe at once. Blue-white streams from the Thesikian batteries, the Loron carriers firing in that synchronized way they have, their weapons producing a harmonic interference pattern that was supposed to amplify damage at the point of convergence. The Marathi destroyers hitting and moving. For about 4 minutes, it looked like it was working. The Vrethkai formation absorbed the fire, some of it. Their hulls, those dark, rocky-looking hulls, did something complicated that I still don't fully understand, even having read the post-battle analysis reports. Deflection, not shielding. Like the surface of a body of water deflecting a stone thrown at a shallow angle. The energy of the coalition weapons struck the Vrethkai hulls and was redirected, not back at the coalition, but sideways, dispersed into space in directions that minimized damage. Some of it got through, I could see it. 3, maybe 4 Vrethkai ships took hits that seemed to do real damage, their hulls fracturing in the ways you'd expect from a struck object. They fell out of formation. 2 of them went completely dark. But there were so many of them. That was the second problem, the numbers. When the debris field configuration broke apart and the Vrethkai ships fully revealed themselves, the count on the tactical display that someone had helpfully connected to the level 4 observation screens showed 417 hostile vessels. I heard someone read that number out loud, 417. And then quiet. The coalition had assembled a combined force that was, by any historical measure, enormous. 142 warships of various classes, support vessels, tenders, the station's own modest defense batteries. Impressive, powerful, everything the known galaxy could put together in 3 weeks. Against 417 Vrethkai ships. With weapons the coalition had no countermeasure for. I want to be very precise here. I'm not saying the coalition commanders panicked. I don't think they did. The formation adjustments I was watching on the displays, the way the cruiser wings began pulling back to consolidate rather than extending to flank, that was tactical reasoning. Sound tactical reasoning. When you're outgunned and you've discovered your weapons are partially effective, you consolidate, you buy time, you look for a leverage point. But they were losing. From the first moment they were losing. And they knew it. You could tell by the communications traffic. I was close enough to one of the crew members monitoring station comms to catch fragments, short transmissions, terse, the language of people making difficult decisions quickly. It was during the second hour that things on the station began to change in ways that had nothing to do with the battle outside. The station itself was supposed to be non-combatant, a way station, not a military installation. The defense batteries it had were mostly for dealing with debris and the occasional piracy problem. Against Vrethkai ships, they would have been approximately as useful as throwing rocks at a storm. Station Commander Arith, a compact, gray-furred Thesikian woman who I'd interacted with exactly twice in 3 months, both times about missing cargo manifests, had locked down the civilian sections 2 hours into the battle. Blast doors sealed. Non-essential personnel ordered to shelter areas. The contractors and journalists on level 4 technically should have been in the shelter areas, but Arith had other things to worry about and nobody had come to move us. We stayed. Of course we stayed. When something that large is happening, you don't move away from the window. You can't. Some instinct older than civilization keeps your eyes on the horizon. Around the 90-minute mark, I noticed that the pattern of the battle had changed. The Vrethkai were no longer pushing forward. They had been advancing steadily, not fast, but with the deliberate quality of something that knows it doesn't need to hurry, and now they had stopped, held their position. The amber light weapons still fired, but in a different rhythm, not attacking so much as suppressing, keeping the coalition fleet in place. And some of the Vrethkai ships had broken off from the main formation and were moving, not toward the battle, toward the station. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that this was the most frightened I had ever been. I am not someone who deals in exaggeration about my own emotional states. I have a tendency toward understatement, actually, a lifetime habit of treating things as less dramatic than they are. Ask anyone who knows me. But watching those dark, rocky shapes detach from the formation and angle themselves toward Vethara Station, I felt something go cold and specific in my chest. Not panic, more like sudden, absolute clarity about what was about to happen. I turned around to look at the other people in the observation deck. The two Loran scientists had their instruments pointed at the approaching ships, their multi-limbed hands moving with professional focus even though their body posture, the forward curl of their central spines, showed something that, in Loran body language, corresponds roughly to dread. The journalists had stopped talking entirely. One of them, a young Thesikian woman with green and gold press markings on her crest, was recording everything with her personal device. The other one had simply sat down on the floor, back against the wall, watching the tactical display. The station maintenance crew had moved to the far side of the deck, the cluster instinct of the frightened. And then there was the sound. Low. Below the threshold of what you'd normally call a sound, more something you felt in your sternum than heard with your ears. A subsonic vibration that came from outside the station walls and cycled slowly, like breathing. The Vrethkai ships, holding position at about 800 kilometers from the station, had turned on something. We would find out later that it was a communication device, though communication is maybe not quite the right word for what the Vrethkai intended it to do. It was designed to produce a psychoacoustic effect in most known sapient species, a kind of deep, sustained discomfort that the Vrethkai used as a precursor to, well, to their version of an ultimatum. At the time, all any of us knew was that the air inside Vethara Station had begun to feel wrong in a way that was impossible to define and impossible to ignore. That was when the transmission came in. Station Commander Arith's voice, over the general system, not calm exactly but controlled. The kind of controlled that takes effort. Attention all personnel. We have received a direct transmission from the Vrethkai command vessel. The translation is being reviewed. Shelter protocols remain in effect. Station defense is on standby. Maintain your positions. I looked at the crew member near me, a young Veth, maybe 18 standard years, responsible for monitoring secondary sensor arrays. She was listening to something through her earpiece, and her hands had gone very still. "What does it say?" I asked her, quietly, not wanting to make the question bigger than it was. She looked at me, and in that look was something I didn't want to interpret. "They're offering terms," she said. "Conditional withdrawal. If we surrender the station and clear the fleet from the breach approach, she stopped. "They'll what?" "They'll let the civilian vessels leave. And the military ships, and the station." She didn't answer that. The coalition's battle group commander, after Thesik's death, a Loran named Veth-7 Resonance, which is what the translation systems made of their actual designation, transmitted a response to the Vrethkai terms within 6 minutes. I don't know exactly what the response said. The communications crew didn't volunteer details and I didn't push, but I could read the shape of it in what happened next. The amber light weapons began firing in a different pattern, not the suppressing rhythm, the destroying rhythm. Yavara Thesik's flagship went 8 minutes later. And then it was real, viscerally, undeniably real, in a way that it hadn't quite been before. The coalition had refused the terms, and the Vrethkai were making clear what refusal cost. The Verath Ascending, that enormous vessel that had made the level 4 windows purple when it arrived, broke across the middle in silence and fire. I set down my coffee. I sat down on the floor. I thought about my family back on Solin 3, my sister and her kids. My mother, who was probably, at this exact moment, asleep because it was the middle of the night in her part of the planet, and she didn't know. I thought about the shape of the galaxy I'd grown up understanding, the coalition, the peace, the sense that the known species had reached something stable, and I thought about how I had never really interrogated whether that stability was fragile, whether it had always been sitting on top of something that could break. It clearly had. Around me, other people were doing similar things. Some were talking quietly to each other. One of the journalists was dictating something into his recorder. I think he was writing his account, even then, the professional instinct overriding the fear. The Loron scientists were still working, which is probably the most Loron thing I can imagine. The third hour was the worst. The coalition fleet was down to about 60 functional vessels. The Vrethkai formation had closed to within 200 kilometers of the station. The subsonic vibration in the walls had grown more intense. You couldn't ignore it anymore, couldn't tell yourself you were imagining it. It was in your teeth. Your vision pulsed with it slightly. Veth 7 Resonance's remaining fleet had pulled into a tight defensive formation centered on the station, not because they thought they could win from that position, because they were protecting the station, or trying to. The Loron and Thesikian tactical doctrine, I learned this later, prioritizes civilian infrastructure protection even in a losing engagement. You don't retreat and leave the civilians. You stay. You take the hits. You buy time. For what at that point, I genuinely didn't know. Neither, I think, did they. The Vrethkai seemed to know this. They had slowed their advance again. Not stopped, but slowed, moving with that unhurried quality that I had noticed early in the battle and that now, after 3 hours of watching it, I had come to understand as a deliberate psychological instrument. They weren't in a hurry because they didn't need to be, because they knew what the result would be, because they were, in their own way, being merciful, or what they considered merciful. Ending it slowly enough to give the option of surrender, fast enough to make the alternative clear. I hated that slowness more than I had hated anything in my life. And then, and I want to be very precise about this, because this is the moment everything turns, Commander Arith's voice came over the general system again. All personnel, we are receiving an inbound transmission from the far transit point. Authentication codes there, stand by. A pause, longer than it should have been. The kind of pause that happens when someone is reading something twice because they don't trust what they read the first time. Transmission source authenticated. We are receiving another pause. We are receiving 3rd Expeditionary, 7th Combined Arms, Unified Human Defense Command. Authentication confirmed. And then the young crew member near me, the one with the sensor array job, the one who'd been so careful and controlled and professional, made a sound that I can only describe as the sound of a person who has been holding their breath for 3 hours, finally letting it out. The humans, she said, the humans are here. Now I need to explain something. Because your reaction to that sentence, the humans are here, depends entirely on what you know about humanity in this period. And if you're listening to this account fresh without that context, you might hear the humans are here and think, so what? One more species, one more fleet, 60 vessels or so, probably maybe 100. Coalition reinforcements, welcome but surely too few, too late, against 400 Vrethkai ships. That's what I thought in that first second. I thought more ships, good, not enough but good. I was wrong. But let me finish setting the scene first, because what happened next unfolded over about 45 minutes, and those 45 minutes need to be told in order, need to be understood from the inside, the way I experienced them, not in the clean retrospective shape they've been given in the official histories. The far transit point was about 11 minutes from the station at standard approach speeds. The tactical display showed the new contacts appearing at the edge of its range, small dots at first, and then more dots, and then more, and the person at the display said quietly, "The count's still going up," and a few of us moved closer to see. The count was still going up. At the 3-minute mark, it was at 200. At the 5-minute mark, it was at 400 and something. At the 7-minute mark, someone said, "That can't be right," because the number on the display had crossed 600 and was still climbing. At the 9-minute mark, the Vrethkai had stopped moving entirely. The first human ship to come into visual range of Level 4's observation windows was a vessel called the UHDS Unyielding Meridian. I know its name because it was broadcast, deliberately loudly, on every open frequency, as it crossed the threshold into visual range. A voice, human, speaking in galactic standard with an accent that I would later learn was called American English, and that is one of the most purely assertive sounds I have ever heard in my life. This is the UHDS Unyielding Meridian 3rd Expeditionary Fleet Unified Human Defense Command. We are here in response to Coalition Emergency Beacon 77 Alpha. All Vrethkai vessels, stand down or be stood down. I say again, stand down or be stood down. That was it, no elaboration, no negotiation language, no conditional clauses. The unyielding meridian itself appeared in the observation windows a few seconds later, and I want to be honest with you about my first reaction. I wasn't immediately impressed. Human ships, and I'd seen human ships before, briefly, at other stations, look different from most coalition warships. They're less elegant. They have a particular aesthetic that I can only describe as deliberately brutal. All angles and mass, weapon systems not streamlined into the hull but mounted externally in a way that makes them visible, obvious, intentional. Like the ship itself wants you to know exactly what it can do to you. The unyielding meridian was large, larger than I'd expected from a vessel that classification would call a destroyer. It moved through space with a quality that I can only describe as weight, not slow, because it absolutely was not slow but heavy, purposeful in a physical sense, like a very large stone thrown very precisely. And behind it, the rest of 3rd Expeditionary Fleet was coming through. They came in formation. I'm told that this formation has a name, that it's a specific human tactical configuration called the hammer wall, spread across an arc that covered the entire approach vector to Vethara Station. Not clustered together, not spread thin, distributed in a pattern that maximized overlapping fields of fire while minimizing exposure to the Vrethkai weapons. The Vrethkai amber light weapons, I should note, were no longer firing. The Vrethkai formation had pulled back. Not much, 50 kilometers maybe, but it had pulled back. And in the council chambers aboard the Vrethkai command vessel, wherever that was, whatever that looked like, I imagine there were conversations happening, recalculations, a review of information that might, until this moment, have been incomplete. Because the Vrethkai were patient, strategic, intelligent, and they had been patient and strategic and intelligent about a great many things, but they had been watching the known galaxy from the other side of the breach for a long time, compiling information about every coalition species, every fleet, every capability. They had been less thorough about humanity. I'm going to tell you about a man named Lieutenant Commander Dara Osai, because he is the person who makes this specific part of the story coherent, and because I met him later, and he is one of the most memorable humans I have ever spoken to. Dara Os was 38 years old at the time of the Battle of Vethara Station. He commanded the UHDS Relentless Purpose, a midline vessel in 3rd Expeditionary's second wave. Medium class, designation CG-114, with a crew of 412 humans and a weapons load that I am still not cleared to fully describe. I'm telling you about him now because what he told me later, about what it was like from inside the human fleet during those first moments, is the other half of what I witnessed from Level 4, and you need both halves to understand what actually happened. He told me that when 3rd Expeditionary dropped out of transit drive, and their sensors painted the full picture of what was in front of them, the burning hulks of coalition ships, the 60 surviving vessels pulled tight around the station, 400+ Vrethkai ships holding position, the station itself intact but clearly in duress. There was a moment of about 3 seconds aboard every human ship where everyone saw everything at once. 3 seconds. And then the fleet was in motion. Because that's the thing about human soldiers, and this is not a boast, or not just a boast, it's an observed fact that comes up again and again in the tactical literature if you read it. They don't spend time being shocked. Shock is something that happens to them on the inside quietly while they're doing what needs to be done. The outside keeps moving. The hands keep working. The commands keep being given and followed. Osai told me that he remembers thinking, clearly, 417 of them and we've got 640 of us, plus whatever the coalition's got left, that's workable. And he had said this to his XO and his XO had said, "Aye, sir, workable," and they had moved on to the tactical specifics. Workable. 417 Vrethkai ships with weapons that had just destroyed a coalition fleet in 3 hours, and the human response was workable. I've turned that word over in my mind many times since. The Vrethkai resumed fire at the 12-minute mark after 3rd Expeditionary's arrival. I think, based on what the analysts later pieced together, that this decision came after the Vrethkai command ran their models and concluded that the human ships, while numerous, were not qualitatively different from coalition ships in any relevant way. They had come through the same physics. They breathed air, bled, died. Their ships used drive systems the Vrethkai had catalogued. Their weapons operated on principles the Vrethkai had studied. The amber light weapons fired in a pattern, targeting the leading edge of 3rd Expeditionary's hammer wall. And what happened next is something I have seen on recording many times since that day, because there are recordings, the human fleet's own systems, the station's external cameras, the Loron scientists' instruments, and none of them quite capture it the way it looked through Level 4's polarizing windows at the moment it happened. The amber light reached the human ships, and the human ships drove through it. Not all of them. 3 vessels in the forward position absorbed direct hits and lost their drives. The amber light weapon worked on human technology the same way it worked on coalition technology, and those ships went dark and began to drift. 3 ships, 3 crews. Gone. But the other ships, the other 637 ships, drove through the dispersed edge of the weapon's effect with what I can only describe as absolute refusal to stop. Their hulls were not immune. The energy was not deflected. Whatever the Vrethkai weapon did to a ship's systems, it was doing it to human ships too, just at the margins, just at the edges of the wave, and you could see it, lights flickering on the human vessels, drives stuttering for fractions of a second. They kept coming. More amber fire. Heavier now, the Vrethkai accelerating their rate as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. 4, 5, 6 direct hits on human ships. Some went dark. Some did not. Some took a direct hit and kept their drives, kept their weapons, kept moving, trailing damage signatures that on any other vessel would have meant immediate withdrawal. They did not withdraw. "Oh," said someone behind me on Level 4, in a voice full of something between disbelief and the very early edge of hope. "Oh, they're not stopping." I want to tell you something about human ship construction, because it's relevant. The reason some of those human ships survived direct hits that should have killed them is not because of superior technology, exactly. It's because of a design philosophy that, as far as I can tell, is unique to humanity among the major spacefaring civilizations. Every other coalition species builds their warships with efficiency in mind, minimize mass, streamline systems, integrate weapon and drive and life support into the most compact, optimal configuration. Less mass means faster ships. More efficient power distribution means more effective weapons. Integrated systems means easier maintenance. Human warships are built on a different principle, one that they call in their language redundancy. It means this: don't put one of anything essential, put 3, put 5. Build each system so that it can fail and the ship still functions. Build the hull with layers, not surfaces, inner hull, outer hull, void space between them filled with damage-absorbing material, then another inner structure. Put backup drives on the backup drives. Put manual systems next to automated ones so that, when the automated ones fail, a person can sit down at a console and keep the lights on. Humans design their ships expecting to be damaged, expecting to take hits, expecting to lose systems and keep fighting anyway. And they crew those ships with people who have been trained exhaustively, relentlessly trained to keep fighting when their ship is on fire and their instruments are down, and the tactical display is showing them things they don't want to see. 3,000 years of human military history, from the earliest wars on their home planet to every conflict in their relatively short spacefaring era, had produced a military culture with one core, immovable principle: you do not stop. The Vrethkai had not known this, or had not known it well enough, or had perhaps known it intellectually but hadn't truly modeled what it meant in practice, what it looked like when an enemy absorbed your most effective weapon and just kept coming. Third Expeditionary's return fire hit the Vrethkai formation at approximately the 14-minute mark, and the level 4 windows went completely opaque for about 4 seconds. I have never been so glad of polarizing glass in my life. When the windows cleared, the leading edge of the Vrethkai formation was gone, not disabled, gone. The human weapons, and again, I'm not going to try to describe the technical specifics because I don't fully understand them, and the parts I do understand are classified. We're operating on a principle that the Vrethkai hull deflection couldn't handle. Not because the deflection had been countered, because the human weapons delivered energy in such quantities that it didn't matter whether 60% of it was deflected. The 40% that made contact was still enough. 7 Vrethkai ships destroyed in the first volley. 7 ships that had, 3 hours ago, been part of a force that was destroying the best coalition warships in the known galaxy one by one. Gone. The Vrethkai response was to break formation. And here's the thing about breaking formation, and I only know this because Osa explained it to me later, in a bar on Solen 3 months after the battle, over drinks that I paid for because I owed him more than drinks could cover. Breaking formation against an enemy in a hammer wall configuration is exactly what the hammer wall is designed to make you do. The formation creates pressure in the center and threatens to collapse the flanks, so the natural response is to break and scatter, because scattering feels safer. And scattering is what the human tactical doctrine specifically accounts for, because scattered ships are individual ships, and individual ships, even large ones, even powerful ones, are manageable. You can chase them. You can isolate them. You can apply overwhelming local force to each one. The Vrethkai had been a single, coordinated, terrifying thing. 417 ships moving in concert, communicating, covering each other's angles. Third Expeditionary cracked that concert open in the first 4 volleys, and then the Vrethkai weren't 417 anymore. They were hundreds of individual problems, and humanity had 640 ships that were very, very good at solving individual problems. The next hour was the most intense thing I have ever witnessed. I will not pretend I understood all of it. I will not pretend that I wasn't sitting on the floor of level 4, back against the wall, watching the tactical display because the windows were too much, too constant, too overwhelming, too bright with things I couldn't parse fast enough to make sense of. What I understood was this. The human fleet was taking losses, real losses. The Vrethkai weapons were finding their targets and human ships were going dark. I watched the human count, and it went down. Slowly compared to what was happening to the Vrethkai side, slowly enough to matter. But it went down. People were dying out there. Hundreds of people per ship, 412 on Osai's vessel alone, and it was one of the smaller ones. And the human fleet kept going. There was a moment, I cannot tell you exactly when, but it was somewhere in the third hour of the battle overall, the second hour of the human engagement, where I realized that the balance had shifted. That the tactical display, which for 3 hours had shown a picture of unfolding disaster, was showing something different. The Vrethkai were retreating. Not scattering anymore. Retreating with purpose, back toward the breach, contracting their formation, pulling the scattered ships back into something coherent because scattered wasn't working and they needed to find a new approach. But retreating. They were retreating toward the breach, and Third Expeditionary was following them. Not chasing recklessly, not overextending but maintaining pressure, staying in their hammer wall formation, not letting the Vrethkai consolidate, not letting them pause and recalculate. Because this is another thing about human soldiers that the Vrethkai hadn't adequately accounted for. They are relentless in the pursuit. Every other coalition species, when an enemy retreats, gives them space. Partly from protocol, you allow a retreat because you're allowing the possibility of negotiated resolution. Partly from resource management, chasing a retreating enemy costs fuel and weapons, and puts your own forces in new, unknown configurations. Humans chase, they press. When they have momentum, they do not yield it. When an enemy is moving backward, they make sure the enemy keeps moving backward. It's in their military doctrine. It's in their training. It's in something older than their spacefaring civilization, something from those 3,000 years of wars on their home planet. You keep going, you do not stop when the enemy flinches, you push. The unyielding Meridian reached the breach perimeter first. I watched this through the window. The windows had cleared, the battle had moved far enough from the station that the proximity effects were reduced, the polarization was settling back, and you could actually see the far distances properly. The unyielding Meridian was damaged. You could see it. There were places on its hull where the external weapon mounts were simply gone, where damage had stripped them away. Its drives were running hotter than normal, visibly, the exhaust signature wider and less controlled than it should have been. It had taken at least 2 direct hits from the amber light weapons and probably 6 or 7 partial hit dispersals. It was at the breach perimeter, running at full speed, with whatever it had left. Behind it, Third Expeditionary followed. And the Vrethkai formation at the breach they didn't go through. That's what I couldn't understand watching it. They had been retreating toward the breach. The breach was their origin point, their home territory. Why weren't they going through? Osai explained it to me later. The breach was the prize. It was why the Vrethkai were here, why they'd come through in the first place, not just to destroy the coalition but to hold the breach, to control both ends of it, to make it theirs. Going back through was conceding it, and Vrethkai command apparently was not ready to concede it. So they turned. At the breach perimeter, the Vrethkai formation, what was left of it, maybe 270 ships, turned and made a last stand. And Third Expeditionary met them there. I left the observation deck during the breach engagement. Not because I couldn't watch, because I had to do something. I'd been sitting on the floor of level 4 for 3 hours, and my legs had gone half numb, and somewhere in my chest, something had been wound tighter and tighter and tighter, and the only thing that was going to help it was movement. I walked down the corridors of Vethara Station, which were still sealed, blast doors closed, emergency lighting in amber, different amber than the Vrethkai weapons, different quality entirely, more orange than gold, but I still flinched at it. Past the shelter areas where I could hear voices through the sealed doors, the low sound of many people in a closed space, not panic, just waiting. The station was shaking, intermittently. Not dramatically, nothing was breaking, nothing was giving way. But every few minutes, there would be a vibration through the deck plates, low and sustained. And I realized that the breach engagement was close enough to the station to transmit through space in waves that even the station's damping systems couldn't fully absorb. I found a water ration dispenser in the corridor junction near the cargo processing area, and I stood in front of it and filled a cup and drank it. And then another. And then I sat down against the wall because my legs had made a decision without consulting me. I thought about a lot of things in that corridor. I thought about the crew of the Verath ascending, how many of them there had been, whether any of them had gotten off in escape pods, whether those pods were still out there somewhere, between the dead coalition ships, waiting. I thought about the young crew member on level 4, the one monitoring the sensor arrays. She'd looked about 18. She'd been doing her job right up until I'd left, hands moving on her console, monitoring the feeds, sending updates to station command. In the middle of all of it, doing the job. I thought about the human crews on the ships that had gone dark, the ones who'd taken the first Vrethkai fire, whose drives had gone out, who were now drifting somewhere between the engagement zones. Not dead, necessarily. Some of those ships might be intact, might be waiting for rescue, but dark, helpless. And I thought, sitting in that corridor with my back against the wall and a water cup in my hands, about what it meant, what it took, to fly into something like this, to know what was on the other side of transit, know the coalition had already been losing badly, and still make the turn out of transit, drive and head straight in. I couldn't find a word for it in my own language that felt sufficient. The breach engagement lasted approximately 140 minutes. I know this from the records. I wasn't watching most of it. I came back to level 4 about 40 minutes in and watched the final stretch, but I missed the beginning. I missed the first wave. What I know from the records and from OSI, and from the dozen other accounts I've read and listened to since. Third Expeditionary hit the Vrethkai last stand at the breach with everything they had, not strategically, not with elegant measured force application, with everything, full weapons output, maximum drive. The hammer wall configuration maintained, every ship feeding its targeting data to every other ship, the human fleet operating as a single organism in a way that the Vrethkai, who were also coordinated, who were also sophisticated, apparently hadn't anticipated from a species they'd classified as individualistic. Humans, it turns out, are individualistic in their civilian life, in their art and their commerce and their personal relationships. In combat, specifically, they become something else, something collectivized in a way that their cultural reputation had not suggested. The Vrethkai made a tactical decision around the 80-minute mark to redirect their amber light weapons from the human ships to the breach itself. To collapse it, maybe, or to use the breach's energy in some way. The analysts have several theories, and none of them are fully confirmed because the Vrethkai command ship didn't survive the engagement and its records weren't recoverable. Whatever they intended, it didn't work. What happened instead? The UHDS unyielding Meridian, which had been in the vanguard since the beginning and was by this point running on what OSI described as sheer stubbornness and 3 of its 7 drives, put itself between the Vrethkai weapon discharge and the breach, deliberately, on direct orders from its captain. The ship took the full hit. It did not go dark. It should have gone dark. The tactical systems on the surrounding ships registered it as destroyed. The light emissions from the hit were off every sensor scale. For about 11 seconds, the unyielding Meridian was a sun. And then the light cleared, and it was still there. damaged beyond anything that should have been survivable. Its hull was compromised in 7 sections. Its weapons were largely offline. One of its drives was burning in a way that drives should not burn. It was, by any objective measure, a wreck. But it was still moving, still between the Vrethkai and the breach, still transmitting. And its captain, I don't have permission to use her name in this account, but I know what she said, because the transmission was recorded, came through on every frequency, in galactic standard, and in the Vrethkai communication bandwidth for good measure, with this. You're going to have to do a lot better than that. I don't know if the Vrethkai command truly grasped what they were fighting in that moment. I don't know if they had a concept for what they were seeing. A species that takes your best weapon directly and says try again. A fleet that's been taking losses for 2 hours and is still pressing forward. An enemy that doesn't flinch. Whether or not they grasped it philosophically, they responded to it practically. The Vrethkai formation broke again, and this time they went through the breach. Not in the organized, coordinated way they'd come through 3 weeks ago, patient and deliberate and precisely timed. They went through in the scattered, urgent way of something that has encountered a force it cannot model. Ship by ship, sometimes in pairs, the dark rocky hulls disappearing into the breach's energy horizon. The coalition's surviving ships, there were maybe 40 of them left functional, tried to intercept, and they got a few, and then the rest were through. And Third Expeditionary held at the breach perimeter. On the other side of it, 700 light-years away, were more Vrethkai, presumably. The Vrethkai that had been patient for generations, that had built 417 warships and sent them through. There might be 4,000 more on the other side, or 400,000. Nobody knew. But this side was clear. The battle was over. They announced the end of hostilities over the station general system at approximately 3:47 station time. I was back on level 4. I had been there for the last 40 minutes, watching the windows, which had cleared entirely now, the breach perimeter distant enough that the light from it was just a faint shimmer, almost beautiful in a way that made me feel guilty for finding it beautiful. Commander Arith's voice, steadier than it had any right to be. All personnel, Coalition Command has confirmed cessation of Vrethkai offensive action. Third Expeditionary Fleet has secured the breach perimeter. Vrethkai vessels have withdrawn through the breach. Station status is intact. Emergency shelter protocols are lifted. I say again, shelter protocols are lifted. A pause. Thank you, all of you. Station personnel showed exceptional professionalism throughout. Please take a moment. And then, because Arith was a practical person who knew that people needed things to do, she added, damage assessment teams to stations in 30 minutes, medical to receive Bay 7. The blast doors in the corridor outside level 4 opened with a pneumatic hiss. I could hear it, that breath of released pressure, doors moving that had been closed for 6 hours. On level 4, nobody moved for a moment. And then the young Thesikian journalist, the one who'd been recording everything. She sat down in the middle of the floor and put her face in her hands and made a sound that I recognized, because it was the sound I was making on the inside. Not weeping exactly, more like the sound of something unwinding that had been wound too far. One of the Loron scientists touched her on the shoulder, very gently, with one of their smaller limbs. A gesture of comfort that crossed the species barrier easily because some things don't need translation. I turned back to the window. The stars were exactly where they'd always been. Obvious statement, but it struck me then the battle had happened in this space, enormous and violent and world-altering, and the stars were where they'd always been. The breach was still shimmering in the distance. The dead coalition ships were still out there, dark now, beginning the long drift that would take them wherever momentum carried them. And among them, and I could see it because the station's external lighting had been brought back up and it was illuminating the nearer space, among them were the human ships. The ones that had gone dark, taken by the amber light weapons, drifting with the rest. And the ones still moving, still on drives, running slow and damaged, moving between the dark ships with what I would later learn were rescue operations. The human fleet pulling their dark ships toward the station, getting teams aboard, doing the brutal close-quarters work of finding survivors in wrecked vessels. They'd started the rescue operations before the battle was fully over. That's something I checked later because I wanted to know the timing. The answer was yes. Before the last HFY ship went through the breach, human rescue teams were already pulling people out of dark ships. They weren't waiting, of course they weren't. The human ships began docking at Vethara Station, about 2 hours after the engagement ended. Not the warships. The station didn't have berths large enough for most of them, and there were priorities to sort out. But the smaller vessels, the shuttles and tenders and the mid-range supply craft that 3rd Expeditionary had brought with them, they came in and docked, and human beings walked into Vethara Station for the first time. I was in the main corridor near Docking Bay 3 when the first of them came through. I want to describe what I saw, not what I'd expected or what I'd imagined, what I actually saw. They were not individually impressive. That's the honest truth of it. They are a medium-sized species, shorter than Thesicians, roughly comparable to Veth in overall mass, bipedal in the way that several species are bipedal. They were wearing their military gear, hardsuit under layers, some with partial exoskeletal armor over it, most with helmets off now that they were inside a pressurized environment. They looked tired. That was the first thing. Tired in a way that went down to the bone, the kind of tired that accumulates over many hours of sustained high-stress focus. They were covered in blood, some of them. Their own, I assumed mostly. Injuries that had been treated well enough to function but not well enough to look clean. And they were talking to each other. Not about strategy or debrief, small things. One of them was explaining something to another with hand gestures, animated, and the other one was laughing. Tired laughter, but real. A woman near the back of the group was checking something on a device strapped to her forearm, and then showing it to the man next to her with an expression that I could read as relief. Probably the name of someone she'd been worried about. They walked into the station and they looked around at the corridors, at the station personnel, at the contractors, at the small crowd that had gathered near the docking bay just to see, and they did not look triumphant. They did not look like a conquering force. They looked like people who'd had a very long day and were looking forward to sitting down. I met Osai 3 days later, actually. Not at that first docking moment. He was still aboard the Relentless Purpose, which had taken significant damage and required a full crew stand-down before he could leave. I met him in the station's common area, which had been converted into something resembling a general meeting space, because there were suddenly a great many people from a great many ships who needed somewhere to be. He was sitting at a table with what I can only describe as an enormous amount of food in front of him. Station rations supplemented with some packaged items he'd brought from his ship stores. Eating with the focused intensity of someone who hasn't eaten properly in 3 days. I sat down at the edge of his table. There weren't many seats available, and he looked up and said something in his language that I didn't catch, and then switched to Galactic Standard. Supply contractor. 3 months on the station, I said. Cargo manifest work. You were here for all of it. He'd paused in his eating. Level 4 observation deck. He looked at me for a moment. Rough seat. Yours looked rougher. He considered this, and then something in his face shifted, that tired thing, the bone-deep tiredness, and he pushed some of his food toward me. Eat something. You look like you haven't. I had actually, but not much. I took the food because it seemed important to him to give it. We talked for about 3 hours. That conversation is how I know half of what I've told you in this account. He told me about the transit in, the moment when 3rd Expeditionary sensors painted the picture, about workable, about the hammer wall, about the unyielding meridian and its captain and what she'd said. And at some point I asked him, "Were you afraid?" He didn't answer immediately. He thought about it with the same kind of honesty he'd brought to everything else he'd told me. "Yeah," he said, "of course. You feel it and then you set it aside and you work. That's what training is for. Training isn't to make you not afraid. It's to give you something to do with the fear. Doesn't the fear get in the way?" He shook his head. "The fear is fuel, you use it. The alternative is, you know what happens to people who don't feel it. They make bad decisions. They think they're invincible. Fear is what tells you you're not invincible and keeps you honest." He went back to eating. "What was it like," I asked, "when the meridian took that hit and came out the other side?" He set down his utensil. "Honest answer, I didn't think she'd survive it. I thought for those 11 seconds I thought she was gone." He paused. "And then the light cleared and she was still there and her captain was still transmitting and another pause. "I did something I haven't done since I was about 14 years old." "What?" I cried. He said it the way people say things that are completely true and slightly surprising even to themselves. "Not for long. Maybe 15 seconds, and then I went back to work." I didn't say anything for a moment. "For what it's worth," I told him eventually, "from the outside from level 4, watching the window, there wasn't a moment. Not once. From the minute 3rd Expeditionary came through, there was not a single moment where it looked like any of you were going to stop." He looked at me. "No," he said, "that's right, we weren't." The cleanup took weeks. The Coalition Emergency Committee convened aboard a temporary command station near Vethara within 4 days of the engagement, and they were still in session when I finally got authorization to leave on the first resupply convoy back to the Solen system. I know some of what they concluded. Some of it is public now, years later. Some of it, the parts about what 3rd Expeditionary found when they sent probe drones through the breach, about what the Vrethkai have been building on the other side, about the models for what a future engagement might look like. Some of it is still restricted. What I can tell you: the Battle of Vethara Station cost the Coalition 68 ships and somewhere between 30 and 40,000 lives. The exact number is complicated by the question of what counts as lost. Some of the darkship crews were recovered in those first rescue operations, and some were not, and some of the not recovered ones were found later, and some were never found at all. 3rd Expeditionary lost 93 ships. I want to sit with that number for a second, because 93 ships means a lot of people. The human fleet that arrived at Vethara was enormous, and it won, and it stopped something that was going to be catastrophic, and it lost 93 ships doing it. The Vrethkai withdrew through the breach, a breach closure device developed in the subsequent 6 months by a joint coalition human engineering team, working faster than anything I'd ever seen developed before, because necessity is a remarkable accelerant, sealed the breach from the Solen side. Not permanently, according to the engineers, more like a lock, a very strong lock that would require significant effort to break, that would give plenty of warning before it broke. It's been enough so far. The Vrethkai have not come back through. I went home to Solen 3 eventually. Found my sister and her kids fine. Found my mother still intermittently unaware of quite how close it had been because the news coverage, by the time it reached the general population, had been processed through several layers of committee communication that somewhat reduced its raw terror. Which was probably for the best. My mother made me dinner and asked about the contract work and said I seemed tired. I told her the contract work had been interesting. This was the understatement of my life. I stayed on Solen 3 for about 2 months, sleeping, eating, sitting in my sister's garden in the afternoon watching her children play, which is an activity that, after what I'd witnessed, felt simultaneously completely ordinary and absolutely miraculous. And then I started writing this account, Because I'd lived through something, and the people who live through things have an obligation to describe them, not prettily, not with false resolution or narrative elegance, just truthfully, as best as memory allows.